Last night, they almost texted you. Their fingers hovered over the screen, trembling slightly, as if even the smallest movement could break the fragile wall they had built around their emotions. The glow of the phone lit up their face in the darkness, and for a moment, everything else faded away, the responsibilities, the promises, the life they had chosen. In that quiet space between thought and action, it was just you and them again, just like it used to be. Memories came rushing back, not gently, but all at once, your laughter echoing in their mind, the way conversations with you never felt forced, the comfort of simply existing in the same moment without needing anything more. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was something deeper, something that refused to fade no matter how much time had passed. And in that moment, they wanted to reach out. They wanted to type your name, to say something simple like, "Are you okay?" or "I was just thinking about you," but they knew it would never be just that. Because with you, it was never just anything. Every word carried weight, every silence meant something, every connection felt like it had a soul of its own. They knew that one message could open a door they had spent so long trying to close, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much. You see, loving you didn't end. It didn't disappear or dissolve into nothing. It transformed into something quieter, something hidden, something that lived in the spaces they didn't talk about. It became restraint. It became distance. It became the choice to stay silent when every part of them wanted to speak. And that choice? It wasn't easy. It still isn't. Because the truth is, you don't just move on from someone who felt like home. You learn how to live without them. You learn how to carry their absence without letting it consume you. But every once in a while, like last night, it all comes back. Not because they regret their life now, not because they're unhappy where they are, but because some connections don't disappear just because life takes a different path. Some people leave a mark that doesn't fade, no matter how much time or distance tries to soften it. And you were that mark. You still are. That's why they paused. That's why they stared at your name for longer than they should have. Because they knew if they crossed that line, even with something as small as a message, it wouldn't just affect them, it would affect you too. And maybe you've been healing. Maybe you've been trying to rebuild yourself, piece by piece, learning how to exist without wondering if they'll come back. Maybe you've finally reached a place where your heart doesn't ache the way it used to. And they couldn't take that away from you. They couldn't be the reason you start over again. Because love, real love, isn't always about being together. Sometimes, it's about choosing not to disrupt the other person's peace, even when it means silencing your own heart. And that's what they did. They chose your peace over their impulse. They chose your healing over their longing. They chose to stay quiet, even though every part of them wanted to break that silence. You might think that silence means they don't care anymore. That if you truly mattered, they would have texted, called, shown up somehow. But the reality is often the opposite. Sometimes silence is the loudest form of love. It's the kind that says, "I still feel everything, but I won't let it hurt you again." It's the kind that understands timing matters, that circumstances matter, that not every feeling needs to be acted upon just because it exists. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept, that you can be deeply loved by someone who will never come back. That you can be unforgettable, irreplaceable even, and still not be part of their life anymore. Not because you weren't enough, but because life asked for something different from both of you. And they answered that call, even if it meant leaving a part of themselves behind with you. Last night, when they almost texted you, they weren't just thinking about what they wanted. They were thinking about everything that would follow. The conversations that would reopen old wounds, the emotions that would resurface, the confusion that would creep back into both your lives. Because once you reconnect with someone you never truly stopped loving, things rarely stay simple. Feelings don't return halfway, they come back fully, intensely, sometimes overwhelming everything else. And they knew that. They knew that if they reached out, they wouldn't be able to pretend it was casual. It would matter. You would matter. Again, in a way that would be hard to contain. So they stopped themselves. Not because they didn't miss you, but because they did. Not because they forgot you, but because they remember you too well. And that's the kind of love people don't talk about enough, the kind that exists quietly, without expectations, without demands, without a future to hold on to. It's not the kind of love that shows up in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It's the kind that chooses restraint, that chooses distance, that chooses to protect what once was by not trying to recreate it in the wrong time. And maybe you needed to know this. Maybe you needed to hear that you weren't forgotten in some easy, careless way. That your story didn't just fade into something insignificant. It mattered. It still matters. But sometimes, the most meaningful stories are the ones that don't continue. The ones that end not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to know when to stop. So if you ever feel like reaching out to them, if you ever find yourself staring at their name the way they stared at yours last night, remember this: some doors are meant to stay closed, not because what's behind them isn't beautiful, but because opening them again would change things in ways you might not be ready for. And that doesn't erase what you had. It honors it. It keeps it untouched by the complications of the present. It allows it to remain what it was, real, meaningful, and complete in its own imperfect way. Last night, they almost texted you. But they didn't. And in that silence, there was a kind of love that doesn't need words to exist, a kind of care that chooses what's right over what's desired, and a kind of ending that, even in its quietness, still speaks louder than anything they could have typed, : and maybe you felt something too last night without knowing why. Maybe there was a sudden heaviness in your chest, a random urge to check your phone, a strange pull toward a name you've been trying so hard not to search again. Maybe you told yourself it was nothing, just another passing thought, just another memory brushing against your mind before disappearing again. But some connections don't follow logic. They don't ask for permission to return. They don't care how much time has passed or how carefully you've tried to move forward. They show up unannounced, quietly, and sit beside you like they never left. And last night, in different places, under different circumstances, you both felt it, the same silence, the same restraint, the same unspoken words hanging in the air between two people who once meant everything to each other. It's strange, isn't it? How two people can still be so connected, yet choose to remain apart. Not because the love disappeared, not because the bond was weak, but because life demanded a different version of strength, the kind that doesn't chase, doesn't hold on, doesn't interrupt what has already been decided. The kind that lets go, even when letting go feels like losing a part of yourself you can never replace. Because the truth is, you didn't just lose them. You lost a version of yourself that only existed with them. The way you laughed without thinking, the way you spoke without filtering every word, the way your world felt a little softer, a little safer, just because they were in it. And they lost that too. That version of you, that version of them, it only existed in that space you shared. And no matter how much life moves forward, no matter how many new people come and go, that specific connection remains unmatched, untouched, quietly living in a place that no one else can reach. That's why nights like these feel heavier than others. Because during the day, it's easier to stay distracted. Responsibilities keep you grounded, conversations keep you occupied, and time keeps moving in a way that doesn't leave much room for reflection. But at night, everything slows down. The noise fades. The distractions disappear. And all that's left is honesty, the kind you can't run from, the kind that sits with you whether you're ready for it or not. And in that honesty, you remember. Not just the big moments, not just the obvious memories, but the small things, the way they used to say your name, the pauses between conversations that somehow felt full instead of empty, the comfort of knowing someone understood you without needing an explanation. Those are the things that stay. Those are the things that make forgetting impossible. But here's the part no one really talks about. Missing someone doesn't mean you're meant to go back to them. Feeling connected doesn't mean the story is unfinished. Sometimes, it just means that what you had was real. And real things don't vanish just because they end. They change form. They become quieter, less visible, but they don't disappear completely. And maybe that's what makes this so difficult. The fact that nothing actually went wrong in the way people expect. There was no betrayal that made it easier to walk away, no clear reason to turn the page without looking back. It was just timing, circumstances, choices that had to be made even when they didn't feel right. And those kinds of endings don't give you closure in the usual sense. They leave you with questions, with what-ifs, with moments that feel suspended in time, like they never fully settled into the past. But closure isn't always something you're given. Sometimes, it's something you create. It's the quiet understanding that not every love story is meant to be lived out loud. Some are meant to exist in memory, in feeling, in the lessons they leave behind. And maybe the lesson here wasn't about holding on. Maybe it was about learning how to love without possession, how to care without needing to stay, how to accept that something can be deeply meaningful without being permanent. That kind of love doesn't get celebrated the way it should. It doesn't come with happy endings or clear resolutions. It doesn't fit into the narratives people like to believe in. But it's real. And it's powerful in a way that doesn't need recognition to matter. Because choosing not to text someone you still love? That takes strength. Choosing to respect boundaries that protect both of you, even when it hurts? That takes maturity. Choosing silence, not out of indifference, but out of care. That takes a kind of love that goes beyond words. And maybe one day, years from now, you'll look back at this differently. Maybe the ache will soften, the memories will feel lighter, the almosts won't carry the same weight they do now. Maybe you'll understand that what you had didn't need to last forever to be significant. That it served its purpose in your life in ways you couldn't fully see at the time. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel grateful, not because it ended, but because it happened at all. Because not everyone gets to experience a connection like that. Not everyone meets someone who changes them in ways that stay long after they're gone. Not everyone learns what it means to love deeply and still walk away when it's the right thing to do. That kind of experience shapes you. It teaches you things no easy, uncomplicated relationship ever could. It shows you your depth, your capacity, your ability to feel something real and still choose what's right over what's easy. And that matters more than you think. So if tonight feels heavy again, if you find yourself thinking about them in ways you thought you were past, don't fight it too hard. Don't convince yourself that you failed in moving on just because a memory resurfaced. Healing isn't linear. Letting go isn't a one-time decision. It's something you choose again and again, in quiet moments, in unseen battles, in nights where no one else knows what's going on inside your mind. And you're doing better than you give yourself credit for. Because you didn't reach out. Because you're still here, still moving forward, even if it doesn't always feel like progress. Because you're learning that love isn't always about holding on, it's also about knowing when to release, when to step back, when to protect both yourself and the other person from something that could become complicated again. Last night, they almost texted you. And maybe tonight, you almost text them. But there's something quietly powerful in the fact that neither of you did. Not because the feeling isn't there, but because you both understand something deeper now. Something that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. And that understanding? It's not a weakness. It's not a missed chance. It's a different kind of ending, one that isn't loud or dramatic, but steady, intentional. And filled with a kind of respect that only comes from truly loving someone beyond your own desires. So before you ever decide to break that silence, before you let one moment of emotion turn into something that changes everything again, pause. What are you really looking for? Closure? Connection? Or just a temporary relief from a feeling that will pass if you give it time? Because not every urge needs to be followed. Not every emotion needs to turn into action. Some feelings are meant to be felt, understood, and then gently let go. And maybe that's the real test, not whether you still love them, but whether you can love them enough to leave things as they are. Last night, they almost texted you. Tonight, you almost texted them. And in between those two silences, there exists a story that didn't need another chapter to prove that it was real, and maybe what hurts the most isn't the distance between you two, but the fact that the distance was chosen, not forced. It wasn't something that happened overnight, not some sudden ending that gave you a clear villain or a clean reason to walk away. It was slow, intentional, almost quiet in the way it unfolded, like two people realizing at the same time that love alone wasn't enough to hold everything together anymore. And that realization? It doesn't shatter you loudly. It sinks in gradually, like a truth you keep trying to ignore until it becomes impossible to deny. Because deep down, both of you knew. You knew that if you kept going, something would eventually break, maybe not the love itself, but everything around it. Lives would be disrupted, promises would be questioned, and the kind of peace you both deserved would slowly turn into something complicated, something heavy, something that would no longer feel like the safe space you once found in each other. So you stopped. Not because you stopped loving, but because you started understanding. And understanding is a dangerous thing when it comes to love. It makes you aware of consequences, it forces you to see beyond your own feelings, it asks you to think about the bigger picture even when your heart is begging you to stay in the smaller, simpler one. That's what makes this kind of connection so rare and so painful at the same time. It's not built on illusion. It's not driven by temporary emotions or fleeting attraction. It's real, grounded, deeply felt, and yet, it still isn't meant to last in the way you once imagined. And that contradiction is something most people spend years trying to make sense of. Because how do you accept that something so right can still be so wrong for your life? How do you let go of a person who didn't hurt you, didn't betray you, didn't give you a reason to walk away other than the fact that staying would cost too much? Those are the questions that don't have easy answers. They stay with you, not as open wounds, but as quiet echoes that resurface in moments when you least expect them, like a familiar song playing in the background of a place you didn't plan to visit, or a random memory triggered by something small and insignificant that suddenly feels overwhelming. And in those moments, you realize that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to coexist with the memory without letting it control you. It means accepting that some parts of your story will always belong to someone who is no longer in your life. And that's not a failure. That's just reality. But reality doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make the nights any less heavy or the thoughts any less persistent. It just gives you a framework to understand why things are the way they are. And sometimes, understanding is the only kind of closure you'll ever get. Because the truth is, if they had texted you last night, everything would have changed again. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in a way that anyone else could see, but something inside both of you would have shifted. The walls you worked so hard to build would have cracked, the boundaries you carefully placed would have blurred, and suddenly, you'd find yourself standing in the same place you once decided to leave behind. And for a moment, it would feel good. Familiar. Comforting. Like coming home after a long time away. But then what? What happens after the initial rush fades and reality steps back in? What happens when you remember why you had to let go in the first place? That's the part people don't think about when they act on impulse. They focus on the feeling, the moment, the temporary relief, but they forget about the aftermath. They forget that some doors, once reopened, don't close as easily the second time. And the pain that follows can be deeper, more complicated, harder to walk away from again. That's why restraint matters. That's why silence, as difficult as it feels, is sometimes the kindest thing you can choose. Not just for them, but for yourself too. Because you deserve a life that isn't constantly pulled back by something that no longer fits into your present. You deserve clarity, stability, a kind of love that doesn't require you to constantly question whether it's right or wrong. And so do they. And maybe that's the most selfless part of this entire story, that both of you, in your own ways, chose not to disrupt each other's paths. You chose not to become a complication in a life that is trying to move forward. You chose not to turn something beautiful into something painful again. And that choice, even though it doesn't feel like it, is a form of love too. A quiet, mature, deeply respectful kind of love that doesn't need to be seen or acknowledged to exist. It just is. And maybe one day, when enough time has passed, when life has taken you both further away from this moment, you'll be able to look back without that ache in your chest. Maybe you'll remember them with a soft smile instead of a heavy heart. Maybe you'll finally understand that what you shared wasn't meant to last forever, but it was meant to change you in ways that would prepare you for what comes next. Because every connection, no matter how brief or incomplete it feels, leaves something behind. It teaches you, shapes you, shows you parts of yourself you didn't know existed. And that's something no ending can take away. So if you're sitting here now, reading this, feeling that familiar pull, that quiet urge to reach out, just pause for a second. Not to suppress your feelings, not to pretend they're not there, but to understand them. To ask yourself what they really mean, what they're trying to tell you. Because sometimes, missing someone isn't about wanting them back. Sometimes, it's just about acknowledging that they mattered. That they were a significant part of your life, and that significance doesn't disappear just because the relationship did. And once you understand that, once you accept that feeling without letting it control your actions, something shifts. The urge becomes less urgent. The weight becomes easier to carry. The silence becomes less about absence and more about peace. And that's when you realize that you're not stuck anymore. You're not waiting. You're just remembering. And there's a difference between the two. Waiting keeps you tied to something that may never return. Remembering allows you to honor it while still moving forward. And you deserve to move forward. You deserve to build something new, something that exists fully in the present without being overshadowed by the past. That doesn't mean what you had wasn't important. It just means it's not where your story ends. So let last night be what it was, a moment of weakness, a moment of reflection, a moment where emotions surfaced but didn't take control. Let it remind you of how deeply you can feel, how much you're capable of loving, how strong you are for choosing not to act on something that could have complicated everything again. Because that strength? It's not something everyone has. And it's something you should never underestimate in yourself. Last night, they almost texted you. Tonight, you almost texted them. But tomorrow? Tomorrow is still yours to shape, still yours to define in a way that isn't dictated by what could have been, but by what still can be. And that's where your focus deserves to be, not on the message that was never sent, but on the life that's still waiting for you to fully step into it, without hesitation, without looking back, without wondering what might have happened if things were different. Because some stories aren't meant to continue. They're meant to teach, to transform, and then to quietly become a part of who you are without needing to be relived again. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough, and maybe this is where the story finally settles, not with a dramatic ending, not with a final conversation that ties everything together neatly, but with a quiet understanding that some things don't need closure in the way we once believed they did. Because closure isn't always a goodbye spoken out loud, it isn't always a last message or a final explanation that makes everything make sense. Sometimes, closure is this silence, this distance, this mutual decision to not go back even when every part of you knows you still could. It's waking up one day and realizing that the urge to reach out is still there, but it no longer controls you. It's remembering them without feeling like you're losing yourself in the process. It's accepting that the love didn't fail, it just fulfilled its purpose in a way you didn't expect. Because not all love is meant to stay. Some love is meant to arrive, change you, and then leave you better than it found you, even if it takes a while for you to see that. And maybe that's the part you're finally beginning to understand, that what you had wasn't incomplete just because it didn't last forever. It was complete in the moments you shared, in the way it shaped your heart, in the lessons it left behind. You don't need another conversation to validate that. You don't need another chance to prove it was real. It was real because you felt it, because it changed you, because even now, after everything, it still lingers in a way that can't be denied. But lingering doesn't mean returning. Feeling doesn't mean acting. And love, real love, doesn't always ask to be continued. Sometimes, it asks to be respected from a distance. And that's what this has become. Not a story waiting to be restarted, not a chapter left unfinished, but a memory that exists exactly as it's meant to, untouched by the complications of trying to bring it back into a life where it no longer fits the same way. Because if you're honest with yourself, you know that going back wouldn't give you what you truly want. It wouldn't recreate what you had. It would only create something different, something influenced by everything that has happened since, something shaped by new responsibilities, new realities, new versions of both of you that no longer exist in the same space as before. And that difference matters. Because sometimes, what we miss isn't the person as they are now, it's the person they were when they were with us. It's the version of ourselves that existed in that connection. It's the simplicity, the timing, the way everything felt before life stepped in and asked for something more complicated. And you can't go back to that. No matter how much you want to, no matter how strong the feeling is, time doesn't move in reverse. It only moves forward. And forward is where your life is waiting. Not in the past, not in the almost, not in the message that was never sent, but in everything that still has the chance to happen. In the people you haven't met yet, in the experiences you haven't lived yet, in the kind of love that won't require you to hold back or step away or choose silence over expression. Because you deserve that. You deserve something that doesn't come with conditions that force you to walk away from your own happiness. You deserve something that stays, not something that almost returns. And maybe that's why this had to end the way it did. Not to punish you, not to leave you with unanswered questions, but to redirect you towards something that aligns with your life in a way this couldn't. Because as beautiful as it was, as real as it felt, it existed in a space that couldn't sustain it forever. And instead of letting it break under that pressure, you both chose to preserve it in the only way you could, by letting it go before it turned into something painful. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's growth. That's a kind of emotional maturity that doesn't get talked about enough, the ability to recognize when something meaningful needs to end, not because it lost its value, but because holding on to it would take away from everything else. And now, here you are. Still feeling, still remembering, but also still moving forward. Maybe slowly, maybe not as confidently as you'd like. But forward nonetheless. And that matters. Because every day you choose not to go back, every moment you choose to stay in your present instead of getting lost in the past, you're building something new. You're creating a life that isn't defined by what you lost, but by what you're still capable of finding. And one day, you'll see the difference. One day, you'll meet someone who doesn't feel like an almost, someone who doesn't require you to question timing or circumstances or whether it's right or wrong. Someone who will stand beside you without hesitation, without conditions, without the need for distance. And when that happens, you'll understand why this had to be the way it was. Not because this love wasn't enough, but because it wasn't the one meant to stay. And that realization won't erase what you felt. It won't make those memories disappear. But it will put them in their place, not as something you're still holding on to, but as something that helped you become who you are now. And maybe, years from now, when this is all just a quiet part of your past, you'll think about them one last time, not with longing, not with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude for what it was, for what it taught you, for the way it showed you how deeply you can feel and how strong you can be at the same time. Because in the end, that's what this was about. Not just love, but growth. Not just connection, but understanding. Not just holding on, but learning how to let go with grace. So this is it. Not a goodbye, not an ending that needs to be spoken out loud, but a quiet closing of a chapter that has already said everything it needed to say. No message will be sent. No words will be exchanged. And that's okay. Because everything that mattered has already been felt. Everything that needed to exist has already existed. And now, all that's left is for you to keep going, to take everything this gave you and carry it forward into a life that is still unfolding, still waiting, still full of possibilities you haven't even imagined yet. Last night, they almost texted you. Tonight, you almost texted them. But this is where it ends, not in sadness, not in regret, but in a quiet, powerful acceptance that some love stories don't need to continue to remain meaningful. Some are complete exactly as they are. And this was one of them, :